art today. In the last several weeks, actually, we've really been looking at the art from the same area, this area all along the Mediterranean, but looked at it through several different lenses. What's going on with Jewish art, what's going on with early Christian art, what's going on with today Byzantine, and that's going to extend for about 1,000 years. And then we'll also see Islamic art, and as that grows. So Byzantine art is around 400 to about 1400. And what we will see is that it's centered here in Constantinople. And we recall that Constantine, the Roman emperor, after he defeats Maxentius, becomes the unified Roman ruler, but he moves the locus of power over here. Now this was a town that was Greek, started by a king Byzantine's, that's his Greek name, and so it was called Byzantian. When Constantine comes, it's renamed Constantine City, so that's Constantinople. And then eventually, from Constantinople, he will reign, his successors will reign the eastern part of the Roman Empire. So about right here is the western part, and by about 400, so within 100 years, the Roman part, that western part, fails. It goes down to the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, invading peoples. The eastern part, led by Constantinople, flourishes for about 1,000 years. And this becomes a very Christian empire. It is influenced by Syria, by Palestine, by Egypt, and by Greece. The language is Greek. And we see actually a huge amount of wealth that comes into this Byzantine Empire. You'll notice that Constantinople is right at the crossing here into the Black Sea. Here's the Crimean Peninsula that's in the news recently that Russia has just annexed back. And this area right here is the crossroads between here is Europe and this is Asia. Okay? So this is the only city, it's modern day Istanbul, that straddles two continents. So you can imagine the great amount of wealth that comes through here, shipping, trading. And a lot of that wealth was then used to create monuments to Christendom. Lots of wealth is then moved into Christian works. Now, this empire grows. We'll see Byzantine works in Egypt. We'll see it in the Palestine area. We'll see it in Turkey, in Greece. We'll also see a major power place in Ravenna. And we'll also go up, way up to the top, you see Vladimir in Russia. I'm going to show you an icon from there. So this becomes the Eastern Empire, becomes the Eastern Orthodox Empire later on. But for the Byzantine world, it's around 400 to 1400 when the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, come in 1453, conquer Constantinople, and it becomes Muslim. So what are we looking at here? Well, we've got quite a few interesting works. And we're going to start with this one. Okay. Now, one of the main facets of Byzantine art is something called the icon. Icon is Greek meaning image, and an icon is something that is a sacred image, and it really has power to it. That's why the article that you have is called Sacred Images, Sacred Power. And this is a typical example of an icon. Usually they're wooden, painted with tempera paints with a gold background, although there can also be mosaics in churches. They could be in many forms. But this is a general one. And what you're looking at here is a depiction of Christ. We know it's him because he has this halo-looking thing. It's called a nimbus. It looks like a golden dinner plate in the back of his head. But if you look very closely, and I don't have my laser pointer today, so I'll reach. You see those red lines over here and over here. There's also one that extends at the top, which means that this is the figure of Christ. Because he's the only one who has a cross inscribed in the nimbus. Okay, so we know who he is. Now let's look at his fingers. He has his fingers up, these two fingers up, and this is something we've seen before. It really is a long transition from, remember this guy, Aulus Metellus, with his arm out, meaning he's speaking to the crowd. And then we get to the conquering emperors like Marcus Aurelius, and that moves to speaking or addressing, and by the time we get to 2 fingers, it's a sign of blessing. So he can do that just with his hand gesture rather than opening his lips the way Aulus Metellus had done it. And he also holds this book. Now, this book looks exactly like the way many books of the Byzantine world and the Byzantine churches would look. The Gospels encrusted in gold and jewels, very, very fancy. But it also will symbolize his the book of life that he has. So let's take a look. And I wanted to be talking about it while his face was up here, so you can take a long while to look at this face. And I want to get your reaction. There's no right answer, there's no wrong answer here. But just tell me what strikes you, what you see when you look at the face here, the figure of Christ in this image. Okay, it looks what?
Unhappy.
Unhappy, okay. Tell me more about what you see. Good. There's some interesting things going on. Okay, yeah, there's something different about the eyes. Like one is different than the other, yeah. So let's talk more about that. How is it different? Okay, so one eye is a little bit darker than the other. On our right, his left, it's a little bit darker. The white around the pupil and the iris on the left-hand side is much clearer and lighter on our left, his right. Okay, let's talk about eyebrows. What do you see?
One eyebrow, that's that eye was different.
Right, okay, so the darker eye has a crooked or pointed eyebrow. The lighter eye has a much more rounded eyebrow. Great. Now let's look at the mustache. What do you see?
I got a two-faced thing going on.
Yeah, tell me more about that. That is a really good observation.
This side looks kind of like clean, healthy. The right side, or our right side looks kind of sick.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, a little sick.
Okay, good. It looks a little sick, so let's talk about that. And that, we already stated a couple of things. It's got a darker eye, the pointed eyebrow, and the mustache there. What's different about that on that side?
Slants down.
Yeah, it's more angular and longer. Okay, so that's exactly what we need to point out here, because there really is a difference if we bisect the face. On one side, it looks quite different, like Two-Face. I like that reference. And on the other side, it's a little bit darker, or you say it looks kind of sick, unhealthy. Yeah, it's a real different view. Okay, so this is what's really interesting, is because we know that an artist has a choice. When you made your self-portrait sculpture, you have a lot of choices to make. How are you going to present an idea? How are you going to do it? What idea were you going to present? And so we know an artist has a choice each time, so that there is an important reason behind these things. So first of all, let's talk about what an icon does, and then we'll talk about the specifics of why we have this two-face thing. An icon is something that's not just an image. In the Byzantine world, an icon really has particular power. An icon is more than just a picture. It is really thought to have the very essence of the person it represents. Meaning, when you look at this icon, you're not looking at a picture, you're looking at the face of God. And therefore, it has particular powers that are associated with that person. People thought icons could cure them. People have stories about how touching an icon healed them of their long-suffering illness, of how it protects a whole city, of how it is imbued with really sacerdotal, with power, with immortal and overhuman powers, supernatural powers. And so icons really weren't just pictures, they were almost living things. Another way to look at it is that these usually rectangular things were portals into another world, kind of like you'd be sucked in like Star Trek or transported, that they provided a window to the sacred. So it wasn't just a picture, it really was something to be revered, to be honored, to be experienced. So they have real power. Now here's the other thing. Let's go back to our two-face understanding. This icon, and many others like it, notice that even underneath this little flavor saver, right? is a little bit off kilter, so it does change how the face looks. That the viewer is going to have a reaction with this work of art. And here's the thing. Everybody's going to come to this work differently. You're going to come differently than I will. And so let's think about what happens in this relationship. Christ, as the Pantocrator, creator of the world, is the one in charge of one's future. And so what this means is he's the one who's the judge, who's the arbiter. He's the one who, with his right hand, will save the lost, with his left hand condemn those forever to hell who are unsaved. And really, let's cut down his face. We see the right-hand side is the side of blessing. That's the side with the lighter eye, with the rounded eyebrow, with the less sinister mustache. The left-hand side, the side of damnation, is the side that has the longer mustache, the darker eye, and the pointed eyebrow. So somebody would come to this work and think, oh gosh, I really didn't do well, I'm very sinful, I'm not going to heaven, I'm really disgusted by my sins, I haven't cleansed myself, and would identify with that right-hand side. Our right is left. Others could come and feel blessed, feel washed of their sins, feel this connection, and would connect with the left-hand side, which is the side of blessing. So really both have to show up in this icon in order for either action to take place. So really it's in the eye of the beholder who comes towards this as to what the end result is going to be. So that's why when we spend a while looking at them, we see, gee, these two sides don't match up. But they have to incorporate both endpoints for the Byzantine faithful follower, because here is the judge, here is the arbiter. He is the one who will make that decision for the afterlife. And so he has this two-faced thing going on, because depending on who looks at him, the result might be different. Okay? So the icon has quite a few different ways of being experienced. This is one of them, this judgment or blessing. Let me show you a couple more examples. Excuse me. Like this one, the Virgin of Vladimir here. And this is from about the 11th to 12th century. Another tempera work on panel. We notice that these are really schematic works, meaning they're not really interested in capturing the volume, the look of a person. They're more interested in concept, the idea. In this case, it's really about the intimacy of mother and child. It's called a Madonna of Compassion. So the baby Jesus is hugging his mother. Yeah, he looks like a sort of a squat, older human, not like a baby. Notice the striations and the drapery. So all of these lines serve to flatten out the picture plane rather than making it voluminous. So these two, with their faces together, show an intimate portrait. And this is to accentuate that desire for a more intimate religion or relationship. This particular icon was thought to protect the city in which it was placed. It was created in Constantinople. Somehow it was taken way up to Vladimir in Russia and was considered the great protector of Russia. So this is called the Virgin of Vladimir. But in the last several centuries, it has somehow been spirited off and is in Moscow at this point. So there's that sort of intimacy, and then there's also this. And this is somewhat instructive and didactic. In this case, we have 4 holy figures across the front, 2 angels in the back. They sort of have silver nymphs. And on the foreground in the middle, we see Jesus in the lap of Mary. And this is a conceit, a kind of unusual representation where he is in the throne of holy wisdom. So she is holding him and she acts like a throne for him. She's an intercessor for him. He's a little baby at this point with a big head. And on the left, St. Theodore, on the right, St. George. Both of these men are known for slaying dragons. And this becomes a symbol for the pagan culture. Dragons and serpents were these pagan images. So Christianity then is now on top of or has overcome the pagans. Notice the difference though. When you look at the angels in the back, we see the bottom of their chin, we see them in 3D form, we see their drapery with shadows, but the figures in the front are very straight and flattened. And that becomes the Byzantine way, is concept over perception. This is like a Roman holdout in the background, something we might find in a Roman painting, mosaic. And then in the foreground, we have this very flattened frontal view, like the Christ image I showed you, that is meant to make these connections. In fact, space is considered very differently in the Byzantine world. In fact, it was thought that lines of sight came from the picture plane to your eyes. Now, when you've ever taken a drawing class, have you ever tried to draw a perspectival room, like a hallway, and you have a vanishing point? So that means parallel lines will come together in that vanishing point, like train tracks. In the Byzantine world, this was not the concept. The idea was that those lines would actually diverge, not converge, because the lines of sight would come towards the eye. So that means parallel lines would move out this way in the picture plane. So it's a very different understanding of space, and that's one of the reasons why it looks so flat. It looks as if they might be cardboard cutouts and would fall right out of this picture. So the icon is very much concept over perception. It very much stays the same. In fact, an icon would be the same for hundreds of years because it'd be copied out of a script rather than the artist's idea of what something looks like instead.
Didn't they realize though, just looking at the pictures and then the real life, that they weren't achieving something photorealistic and that
Yes.
their perceptions must have been off?
Yeah. Oh, but they were not trying to achieve perceptual accuracy. So it's really about this understanding the religion and understanding, why should we even want to paint God like a human? We're really trying to understand God as a God, so he really doesn't conform to how we see things or the real world. And so it was a conscious choice. And it's not until the 15th century, late 14th century in Italy that, the Revolution of Giotto, which we'll get to at the very end of class, this is Cimabue in the 1300s. And it still looks like this. And it's not until Giotto decides to come up with a voluminous form that we get into this perception. Okay, so let's go back to Constantinople here. And by about 500, there's an emperor who becomes the greatest builder of the Byzantines called Justinian. And he begins to rebuild a lot of Constantinople. Interesting story. His wife, the Empress Theodora, is the daughter of circus folk who were bear tamers. And somehow she gets to be the wife of the greatest emperor. And she has a very important role to play. In fact, there should be a new Pixar movie, I think, based on her, kind of like Brave. Because when there was a giant fire in the year 532, and fire destroys much of Constantinople, Justinian wanted to hightail it on out of there. Theodora gets up in his face and says, "Don't you leave this place. We are here, and we are staying, and you'll be a coward if you leave." They stay, and the next month is when he starts building the greatest church in all of the Byzantine world. And that's the Hagia Sophia. Now, just before this, however, he's had to kind of reconquer and consolidate. And he does that because here, by 400, all of this area, the old western part of the Roman Empire, has fallen to those Goths. And he sends a general to reconquer, of course, in the name of orthodoxy, Orthodox Christianity, and reconquers this area here and puts an outpost in Ravenna to help run the Byzantine Empire. And that's where we're going to go first for a church that he builds, and then we're going to head back to Constantinople. So let me take you first to Ravenna, to this. Here. Now this is going to be a centrally planned church with a central dome area and a long walking area around it, and that's very different than the basilica. And then we're going to have a chance to look at the mosaics on the inside. And for that, I'm going to just hop on over here to this. About 8 minutes.
We're in the Italian city of Ravenna, standing outside of the Church of San Vitale. This is a really important 6th century church. It's just really old.
And it's unusual in that it's a centrally planned church. That means its focus is on its center instead of a basilica, which has a long or longitudinal axis.
Right, when we think about a church, we generally think about a building that's shaped like a cross, and it has that long hallway, the nave. This doesn't have that. Instead, it's got an ambulatory or an aisle that surrounds the central space. In this particular case, on the east side of the church, there's also an extension with an apse at the end.
Looking at the outside of San Vitale, we see that it has 8 sides. So it's an octagon, and within that octagon is a smaller octagon that rises higher.
The exterior of the church is brick. Those bricks were taken from ancient Roman buildings and reused here in the 6th century. The walls are pierced with lots of windows, and that's especially important because the interior is covered with some of the most magnificent mosaics that survive from the early medieval period.
And of course you'd want that light glistening on the gold and the beautifully colored mosaics. Let's go inside and have a look.
We walked into the church, and the center towers over us.
And yet, these apse-like shapes that are supported by columns undulates and moves around us.
There are massive piers that help support the building, but there's also a real delicacy. Look, for instance, at the way that the columns are doubled, that is, stacking of one set of columns above the next.
And they move in and out, back into the space of the ambulatory on the ground floor, and then up into the gallery above.
The real gem in this church can be seen on the east end. Let's walk over there. The eastern end of San Vitale is completely covered in dense mosaic.
These tiny pieces of glass and glass sandwiching gold that reflect the light.
We're walking up towards the apse now, this semicircular space. There are 3 large windows, and just above that, a large apse mosaic.
And in the center, we see Christ dressed royally in purple, sitting on an orb, the orb of the earth, of the universe. Below flow the 4 rivers of paradise, and on either side of him, an angel.
Christ is holding the book of the Apocalypse with the 7 seals visible, and in his right hand, he's handing a crown to San Vitalis, who was adopted as the primary martyr of this city.
And on the other side, we see Ecclesias, who founded and sponsored the building of this church, and we see him handing the church to the angel beside Christ. Every surface here in the apse is covered with imagery, with figures, with decorative patterning.
But the only surfaces that really are stone are of a very decorative marble, cut to pair and create wonderful abstract designs. It is this lush, glorious space here in this city that's distant, perhaps, from the capital of the empire, but that speaks to its importance.
Right above the altar, we see an image of the Lamb of God, and the Lamb of God refers to Christ. He's wearing a halo, this idea of Christ as the sacrificial lamb sacrificed for the redemption of mankind.
The Lamb is surrounded by a wreath of victory, in this case, the idea of the triumph of Christianity itself, and that wreath is held in place by 4 angels who stand on globes that refer to the globe upon which Christ in the apse sits.
And then we see Christ again, but this time bearded, older, in the archway at the beginning of the chancel.
Right, the triumphal arch has Christ in the center. It's really a kind of bust-length portrait, and his body is surrounded by a mandorla, kind of rainbow-colored halo. And then moving down the arch on either side are 14 figures, including the apostles.
We see scenes from the Old Testament, specifically ones that prefigure the life of Christ and Christ's sacrifice, and we see scenes from the New Testament.
There are also fabulously decorative columns made out of high-quality marble that was brought from the East. What's most remarkable about these columns for me is that we've really left behind the classical orders. These are not Doric, they're not Ionic, they're not Corinthian. They are early Christians trying to invent a new iconography for their architecture.
And on top of the capitals, we see something called impost blocks that help make the transition up to the arches.
The two most important mosaics in San Vitale flank the apse.
And those show the Emperor Justinian and his Empress Theodora. Now, Justinian and Theodora never actually came to Ravenna.
And they're in the mosaics, we think, to reassert their control over the city.
For much of the 400s, Ravenna was under the control of a Goth, Theodoric. And Theodoric was an Arian. That is, he didn't follow the orthodoxy, the orthodox doctrines of the church.
And basically, the Arians believed that Christ was the creation of God the Father, and therefore was subordinate in the hierarchy of the Trinity.
Christ wasn't co-equal with God the Father the way he is in Orthodox Christian belief. And so Justinian, the emperor in Constantinople in the early 500s, sends his general Belisarius to conquer Italy, to reconquer Ravenna, and reestablish Orthodox Christian belief here in Ravenna.
And the Arian belief was suppressed. And so what we're seeing here is the reassertion of Eastern imperial control. That is, Justinian is in Constantinople in the East, and he is saying, I'm in charge even here in Ravenna, in Italy.
Spiritual power go hand in hand with political power, with the power of the emperor.
We see Justinian in the center, wearing purple, the color that is associated with the throne, and he's surrounded by his court. But there are also religious figures representing the church, and there are soldiers, three centers of power: the church, the emperor, and the military.
So we can see that some of the figures are treated more individualistically than others. Justinian, Maximian are more individualized, and it's possible that people at the time would have looked up and recognized the other figures who are lost to us today. But the figures from the army are much more anonymous.
Justinian, the emperor, authority is divine. You can see a halo around his head, and he holds a bowl associated with the Eucharist, which is handing in the direction of Christ in the apse.
Right, this is a bowl that would have contained the bread for the sacrament of the Eucharist. He's in the center of the composition, he's frontal, but really all of the figures in this mosaic are frontal.
They are schematic, abstracted. This is the medieval. We've left the classical tradition of naturalism behind.
And so if we look closely at the figures, we can see that there's no real concern for accurate proportions. Their feet don't really seem to carry the weight of their bodies. They seem to float in an eternal space and not in an earthly space. Next to Justinian, we see the bishop, Maximian, with his name above him, although that was added later. And beside him, other clergymen.
Maximian holds a beautiful jeweled cross, and he wears the same purple that the emperor wears, associating him with the power of the emperor in Constantinople.
The figures next to him hold the jeweled Book of the Gospels, and the figure at the far right holds an incense burner. What we're seeing here is the emperor leading a procession for the enactment of the sacrament of the Eucharist.
And in fact, the Eucharist would have been performed in the sanctuary. The figures stand in front of a field of gold, which is very much a Byzantine tradition.
And when we say Byzantine, we're referring to the capital of the empire, which is Constantinople.
Which we now call Istanbul. You'll notice that the tesserae, that is, these small pieces of colored glass, many of them with gold leaf that is actually fused almost like a sandwich in between two pieces of clear glass, are set into the wall at angles so that the light reflects off them in a way that is complicated and beautiful and creates a sense of the liveliness of the surface. And that would have been especially true when it was illuminated by candles and by lanterns. Let's walk around to the other side and take a look at the panel devoted to Theodora, Justinian's wife. To the right of the apse windows, we see the panel of Theodora, the empress, and it mirrors the panel with Justinian.
So we have an idea that Theodora, Justinian's empress, ruled as co-equal to Justinian, that she was a very powerful woman, even though she was reputedly of lower class, that she was an entertainer, apparently.
There are some colorful descriptions of her past. She's